My name is Philippe Scrimger, and today I'll be presenting a paper I've been working on with Mathieu Dupuis and Sean O'Brady. And this paper explores the effects of financialization on unions, labor relations, and working conditions more generally. But today, however, I'll be focusing on a specific area of our research program, which is the relationship between financialization and industrial conflict in the form of work stoppages. And we look at this relationship by investigating several Canadian industries over time. So many of us know by now that financialization is important. It is completely transforming or reconfiguring our socio-economic models. It's actually reconfiguring our social lives. And as such, it has been more and more popular as an object of research. And a lot of research has shown that it is having negative effects on workers and the world of work generally. A lot of research has shown that it's diminishing the wage share of labor, it's hurting employment, increasing inequality, and hurting the union institution generally. So again, we look to integrate the stream of literature by focusing on work stoppages in the forms of strikes and lockouts. And we're looking at different Canadian industries over time, specifically from 1997 to 2017. And we also compare two sub-periods to see if there's a financial crisis effect on the relationship. So before speaking more to the relationship itself, let's define financialization, which is not an easy thing to do. CRIMT offers a simple definition, which is financialization is a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. And Epstein adds that it represents the increasing role of finance in financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, financial institutions in the operation of domestic and international economies. The way I like to summarize this is basically nowadays the process of wealth accumulation and production operates more through financial mechanisms rather than through the growth of a real economy. But what's more interesting to us, because we're looking at non-financial industries, is how financialization affects firm behavior. And the big way it affects firm behavior is by moving managerial priorities or strategies from a retain and reinvest strategy towards market growth or share of market growth, towards a downsize and distribute strategy, which is aimed at increasing short-term shareholder value, often by cutting costs and often by cutting labor costs. So that's financialization in a nutshell. So our research on this relationship between financialization and industrial conflict is guided by two questions which are almost identical but refer to different time components. So the first question is, does financialization explain long-term differences in work stoppages across industries? And here the question invites us to compare long-term trends, long-term average trends across industries to see if there's something happening there. And the second question invites us to look at what's happening within all industries over time. So how do short-term fluctuations in financialization affect short-term fluctuations in work stoppages? Now, as for our theoretical expectations, we enunciate two very opposite propositions. And that's probably because we don't have a lot of literature exploring the effects of financialization on conflict itself. So the first proposition is that financialization leads to more work stoppages. And the argument behind this is basically that financialization increases the contradictions between the interests of two competing rent-seeking actors, which are shareholders and unions, and this creates an environment ripe for conflict. So proposition 1, financialization leads to more work stoppages. Proposition 2 is the reverse. Financialization leads to fewer work stoppages. And the rationale behind this is that the rise of finance is basically putting the labor movement on the defensive, and it's contributing to the decline of labor power more generally, and therefore we are seeing an increased asymmetry of power. And it may be argued that in a position of increased asymmetry of power, unions see less returns from conflict, and thus would strive to engage less with those types of tactics or strategies. So in this case, financialization pacifies unions, and we should see fewer work stoppages. As for our methods, we use, for the most part, the bulk of our analysis uses multi-level analysis of time series cross-sectional data, using a random effects modeling strategy. What this allows us to do is to separate long-term from short-term effects in the relationship that we're looking at, hence the two different questions. It also allows us to control differences between sectors using meaningful variables rather than washing it out with fixed effect models. So the data, well, we're looking at, as I said, 97 to 2017, data from 7 non-financial private industries. So 21 years of observations times 7, I hope, makes 147 observations total. As for the source, well, we've compiled data or estimates from the CANSIM public available database, which provides estimates from different Statistic Canada surveys. Okay, operationalization of our key variables. Work stoppages are operationalized using a measure of person days lost due to work stoppages. That means strikes and lockouts per 1,000 employees in each sector. Financialization is measured with, we had to be kind of creative here because there is a lack of industry level data. We have 2 measures of financialization. The first one is share capital as a proportion of total equity. And this, we argue, captures the extent to which non-financial firms are dependent on shareholders for investment. And the second measure that we use is a measure that we call interest and dividend revenue as a proportion of operating profits. And this, we argue, captures the extent to which non-financial firms are deriving revenue from financial means and how that's evolving in contrast to profits from normal operations. And we use a set of controls, common controls, industry level union coverage, the share of employees in large firms in each industry, the share of total employment that each industry has in Canada, and a measure of profitability, which is the return on capital employed. Okay, so now before turning to the multivariate results, some descriptive statistics. Here we have the unweighted average time trends of our 3 key variables. And black at the top, that's also, these trends are presented in natural log form, so I could fit them all on the same graph. But the average person days lost was not 9 in 97. It was in the thousands probably, or in the hundreds at least. So anyway, so the trends, that's more important. The trends are important. Seems like work stoppages are trending down. Industrial conflict is trending down. As for our 2 financialization measures, looks like they were dipping in the first half of the period, and now they're increasing more or less since the financial crisis. But these aggregated trends, they hide a more complex picture. This is our first measure of financialization, share capital. And without going into great details, it does show that there is some diversity across sectors in terms of how financialized different sectors are. And there's also some diversity in terms of time trends. Some sectors are getting more financialized, some sectors are getting less financialized. This is good for us, because if you're doing multivariate regression, you want some diversity, and we have it here. It's a bit of the same thing for our second measure of financialization. Still some diversity, maybe perhaps not as much as our first measure. And again, time trends, diversity there too. Some are becoming more financialized, some are becoming less financialized. And this is our conflict measure across the 7 industries. Here obviously the time trend is more clear. 6 out of the 7 industries are becoming less conflictual in terms of the time trend. There is Mathieu and I have yet to be able to explain what happened in the primary industries prior to 2008, but it was very conflictual, as you can see. But still, again, enough diversity to make to justify looking at the differences between sectors and across time. Okay, as for our multivariate results, I won't go through reading all the effect sizes or the strengths of the relationships, but let's start by looking at first at what the results say about long-term, long-run differences, average differences between industries. And what the results show is that there is a positive and significant relationship between financialization and industrial conflict. So what this means basically is that industries that are more financialized on average in the long run tend to be more conflictual on average in the long run. And both our measures of financialization here were significant at the 0.01 a significant rate. As for short-term changes within all industries, so how do short-term variations in financialization affect work stoppages within all industries over time, like yearly changes? Here again, we find evidence of a positive relationship between the two variables. So short-term increases in financialization are linked or are associated with short-term increases in conflict or work stoppages. However, our significance levels are not as robust here. Actually, only our share capital measure is significant. The other one, our other measure, the sign points in the right direction, but we didn't capture a robust enough estimate. And from having used this modeling strategy many times before, that probably has a lot to do with the fact that our data set is actually quite modest. So anyway, to summarize these multivariate results, well, they're consistent with our first proposition that the contradictions between two rent-seeking actors may be generating conditions in which conflict arises. So continuing with the multivariate results, comparing subperiods, and now we're working with small data sets when we're comparing subperiods because we basically cut the data set in half. We see, however, that the relationships are getting stronger over time. The positive relationship between financialization and conflict was stronger in the second period than the first. So something happened after the financial crisis, which is making conflict and financialization more closely linked. And and the last point, I guess, for our multivariate results is they highlight the importance of looking at these large processes at the subnational level. If we had focused on the national level, we would probably have found a very convincing narrative of financialization decreasing work stoppages, because those two macro trends go in opposite directions. Okay, so to conclude, what sense can we make out of all these numbers? So basically we can tell two stories, and the reason we can tell two different opposite stories is because we are not able to distinguish strikes from lockouts in our dependent variable as of yet. Mathieu and I will do some more data mining probably and see if we can at some point, but because we can't distinguish strikes from lockouts, we have to tell two stories for now. And the first story is the one I prefer, is that increased rent seeking by shareholders produces a combative response from unions in the form of strikes. And that's a better story than the second one, which is that managerial strategies that are geared towards maximizing shareholder value in the short run produce an opening for union repression, maybe in the form of lockouts. And this is plausible because in a world where non-financial firms are generating a lot of revenue through financial means, lockouts become a lot more affordable. And so those are the two stories we're working with now, and we'll see which one is right probably one day. All right, thank you.